My name is Deepak Nair, and I'm from the International Relations Department at the Coral Bell School. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are meeting on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Welcome to this seminar. This lecture is part of a series celebrating the 75th anniversary of the International Relations Department here at the ANU. I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Van Jackson, who will give today's lecture. Dr. Jackson is a senior lecturer in international relations at Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. He is also a senior non-resident fellow at the Center for International Policy in Washington. Van's research broadly concerns East Asian and Pacific security, the intersection of political ideology and US foreign policy, and critical perspectives on the theory and practice of grand strategy. Van has articulated these research interests in what I would describe as an extraordinary burst of creative and prodigious publishing. It consists of several journal articles, book chapters, policy reports, and 5 books. His 2 most recent books were published in 2023, and these are Grand Strategies of the Left, The Foreign Policy of Progressive World-Making, published by Cambridge, and Pacific Power Paradox, American Statecraft and the Fate of the Asian Peace, by Yale University Press. His next book, which is forthcoming in Jan 2025, is also by Yale and is titled The Rivalry Peril: How Great Power Competition Threatens Peace and Weakens Democracy. I should mention that what makes Van so interesting as a scholar of IR today is that he occupies a very distinct space within the field as an avowedly left-wing and progressive thinker of international security. There are not many scholars who approach questions of foreign policy and grand strategy by asking, what does this look like from the vantage point of the working class? And here I believe his own personal biographical experience, having grown up as working class, informs the coordinates of his intellectual project. And for those of you who are interested in learning more about Van and the meshing of the personal and the intellectual in his work, I highly recommend checking out his appearance on Squaring the Circle podcast, where he talks about a working class foreign policy. This was also published on the Undiplomatic podcast, which he runs as well. What? Where does he get the time? So the format for today is that Van will speak for about 40-45 minutes. We'll follow that up with hopefully a lively discussion, Q&A. With that, over to you, Van.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me too. It's weirdly not simple to get from Wellington to Canberra, but when I got the invitation, I couldn't say no to be part of this 75th anniversary IR department thing. I couldn't think of something more. This is the nerd in me, more fun than that. So, sorry, did I press the
left over?
Okay, cool. Okay. I don't have to press any buttons yet. I have to speak to the title slide for a second. So, where do we start? If you open any document about defense strategy, about national security strategy, there's that one word that you see over and over and over, and that's interests. So, the national interest, the national security interest, the vital interest, vital is a big one, especially these days. You see references to this fuzzy object that modern militaries and administrative states have been designed to secure. And what I wanted to explain here today is the irony embedded in that purpose. The national interest as a concept is, I see, a growing source of insecurity in the world because of how governments rely on and exploit it. And to explain why that is, as a framing thing, maybe it's useful to sort of offer a little story about how I came to see this problem in this particular way. So, there we go. Okay, so in 2017, I was writing a book about the North Korean nuclear crisis while it was happening in real time, which is not advisable. And the crisis happened, I mean, North Korea was doing what it does, which is often not good, right? But the crisis happened because Washington had decided that the national interest demanded we escalate pressure on North Korea to unilaterally disarm, even if that risked nuclear war, and it did. That's why we had the crisis, right? And so in that context, Donald Trump is mixing all of these famous fire and fury threats with penis jokes and, you know, body shaming jokes, ironically. And North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-un, reciprocates, right? He starts making his own nuclear threats and mixing in ageist jokes, which was low-hanging fruit. And as part of that sort of farcical but very real escalating tit for tat, one of Kim Jong-un's generals threatened to bracket fire Guam with medium-range ballistic missiles. So this is where the missile lands, envelopes it, lands on either side of the territory, because if you can do that, you've proven that you can hit the target, right? And then Kim Jong-un repeats the threat. And this lodged in my mind in a very kind of bothersome way, even in relation to all the other nonsense that was being spewed by both sides. It was predictable. It wasn't the first time that North Korea had made this kind of nuclear threat against Guam. But I couldn't shake it. There was something about it that was jarring to me, even amidst so much nonsense. And in hindsight, that moment opened up a kind of Pandora's box for me of questions about the national interest. So everything is personal and political at the same time, right? I'm not Chamorro, I'm not from Guam, but I do have a little bit of Pacific heritage. I lived in Hawaii for a while, and I was vaguely aware, because of that stuff, that Guam was an American colony, and that's not something that most Americans even know, right? There was a time when I didn't know it. But it is. It's one of the world's 17 non-self-governing territories. It wants nationhood. It doesn't get nationhood. It can't even hold a referendum on nationhood. And yet it also doesn't have votes in the US Congress. It's not a state in the US federal system. They have no ability to veto America's military decisions. They have no status of forces agreement like a normal country gets when they host US troops. And even though a lot of people in Guam are pro-American, they aren't necessarily in favor of hosting a US military presence that occupies 27% of its territory and is currently expanding to 1/3 of its territory, right? And this is a place where culturally the land is, of course, sacred, right? It's not just soil, it's sacred. And so Guam has to play this role as a sacrifice zone for US military strategy. And there's nothing Guam can do to change that reality as long as it remains a colony. So I have this knowledge in my head, and I hadn't, prior to that point, associated it with the kinds of strategic analysis that I had been doing. But now I'm seeing Kim Jong-un threatening to nuke Guam, and it's not because of anything the Chamorro did, but it's because Guam hosts Andersen Air Force Base, which is a nuclear bomber base, right? North Korea knows, just like China knows, that any war with America should target Guam in the first phase of a military campaign. You know, Guam is among the first targets anytime there's going to be a conflict with the US. And the idea that all of this, you know, the nuclear death, the dick jokes, the 21st century colonialism that we pretend isn't happening for some reason, the idea that all of that is based on the need to preserve a particular understanding of what was in the interest of the American nation as an American, I found absolutely, I'm not going to cuss today, galling, right? How could it be in America's interest to require in 2017 that the Chamorro in Guam might have to die in a mushroom cloud. That's unjust. It's also very stupid. Like, what are we doing? So, the universal is always found in the particular, right? The Guam situation in 2017 was, turned out to be one of these like everything, everywhere, all at once moments, right? For understanding something that's gone very wrong in what we call national security. And coming to terms with that as part of that process, it forced me to start asking questions that don't have comfortable answers. Like, who pays a price for the choices we make in the name of the national interest? Who actually gets to be secure as a result of national security policies? And who and what must be sacrificed in the concrete, in specific, in the real world, because of abstract ideas guiding our foreign policy choices. And so for my project, which this is sort of part of, I'm not really doing middle range theory testing, not that there's anything wrong with that, but this is not conventional international relations work. This is very much political theory. This is an imminent critique of the concept that has become the lodestar for all modern geopolitics and foreign policy. And so what I'm arguing ultimately is that national security as such is beyond the national interest as we conventionally understand it. So as a discursive terrain, as a operating rhetoric, we have to think about what the national interest, not just take for granted, what it favors, what it unlocks, what it inhibits, what it forecloses, what it occludes. As a concept, we have to take seriously its internal coherence as it gets put into practice. And as a historical practice, we have to pay close attention to how governing elites and analysts use the national interest as a referent, like what it deflects from and what it is what's justified in its name, you know? So we have to do all this because our governments are spending obscene levels in blood and treasure to secure the national interest. And yet in my lifetime, the world has never felt more insecure. There's a contradiction there, and most of us feel it in our bones, right? And so what I'm going to do is walk through the architecture of this contradiction, and specifically I'm going to try to unpack this as 3 different ways that pursuing the national interest ends up in practice today doing harm to peace, democracy, and equality. And those are things that normal people would judge to be very much in the national interest, right? And the point of this is that if we start from a place of clarity about how the pursuit of the national interest is leading to its opposite, we can unlock new possibilities, right? We don't have to actually get rid of the nation or even the concept of interests in order to realize meaningful security in this world. We just have to face the contradictions, right? So, what are we talking about when we talk about the national interest? My starting point is Udo Welds, who is a constructivist, identified the national interest as a social construct. I think this is not wrong, right? Benedict Anderson identified it as the nation as an imagined community. Surely that community has interests, right? But we're talking about fictions that are territorially bounded and anchored in something. They become real because we say it's real, right? The important thing, though, is to understand that the nation is the thing that justifies the state. So we have a habit of speaking of nation states, of national states, and there's an immense amount of mystification happening when we do that. And a few scholars have seen this very clearly, right? George Orwell is one, very critical of nationalism, scathing critique of nationalism, in fact. But there are many others. Just a couple examples. The one that jumps out for my purposes here, among these quotes, is Eric Hobsbawm, who insisted that nations do not make states and nationalism, but the other way around. And that's quite a revealing statement. And what's useful about that, and what's useful about some of these other similar ways of understanding the national interest, is that it gestures toward two entangled assumptions that make the contradictions of the national interest possible. So the first assumption is what I call the spatial fix, or the fallacy of the spatial fix, right? So I'm sure many of you have heard geopoliticians make arguments about some country or particular geography that is the pivot point or the linchpin, right? The pivotal location. The most recent version of this these days is like, he who controls Taiwan controls Asia, he who controls Asia controls the world, right? The idea of the spatial fix is that security can be bought by exercising coercive control over a particular geographic space that's out there, right? So the ability to impose coercive power or to project force out there brings security here, right? And this is a seductive way of thinking for policymakers because it promises a way out of wicked problems, you know? And my problem, or my concern, is that it's a false promise in most instances. And there's really no standard for vetting these kinds of claims. And as the basis for national security, the spatial fix is an alternative to remedying the pathologies with insecurity thinking. Like, it's a way of avoiding the same contradictions that I'm saying we need to confront, right? So, and also, you know, there's a fallacy here insofar as there's not a lot of security in spatial solutionism. Like, spatial reasoning is a band-aid on a bullet hole when it comes to security. So not only does it treat as fixed outcomes moments that are actually part of historical processes, it also confuses a hypothetical advantage or hypothetical disadvantage in certain, like, worst case scenarios with national security or the interest of the whole of a nation. And those are not the same things. The second assumption that makes these contradictions possible is the assumption of divisible security. Now, there are obviously situations where my security might need to mean your death or your sacrifice or your exclusion. You can construct such situations, you can pluck such situations out from history, but it's not and shouldn't be normal, right? The exception, the outlier case, ought not be the thing that dominates our imagination, but it's become naturalized, this assumption, in most traditions of IR theory. It's pervasive in security studies and strategic studies. That's not necessarily warranted, you know? And it is possible, of course, like I said, to come up with examples that might seem to validate either of these assumptions, spatial fix or divisible security. But they're clearly not always true. Philosophically, there's a case to be made that they're just wrong. You know, if you think about something like a slogan, like no justice, no peace, that's an ethos, it's a demand, but it's also a causal observation. It's a causal observation at odds with the assumption of divisible security. And as I said a second ago, if we take our empirical evaluations not as snapshots, but as historical processes, we know that externalizing violence, hierarchy, and exclusion generates negative feedback, blowback, unintended consequences. It changes who we are, right? From Amy Césaire to Fanon, we know that, for example, colonialism, a form of divisible security, transforms not just the colonized, but the colonizer too. And the trouble here is not just that these assumptions are partially incorrect or dubious in some sense. It's also that you can see how these assumptions could lead to a politics of reaction and deflection. Just because these assumptions can sustain systems of violence or can maybe instrumentally help liberate people from oppression, depending on specific circumstances, that does not mean that these assumptions are value neutral. They are not, right? So one of the other things that Eric Hobsbawm noted was that nations exist not only as functions of a particular kind of territorial state, but also in the context of a particular stage of technological and economic development. This, I think, is a profound point. Without this, I don't know that the rest of the lecture can even make that much sense. So I'll return to this in a minute, but trying to make a better world requires that you understand, navigate the balance of political forces in your world and the terrains of struggle in your world, in your historical conjuncture. And the national state with national interests is part of that right now, and it has been for a couple hundred years, and we're 150 years, 100, whatever. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing for international security, though, it depends on what else is going on in different times, skews a different way maybe. But in our current conjuncture, the national state and its national interest is tilting overwhelmingly in the direction of the forces of militarism, the forces of reaction. So to the contradictions that these assumptions make possible. The most obvious contradiction, unit-level approaches to system-level problems. This is not necessarily new, or at least I hope it's not new. National frameworks for mobilizing resources and collective action are logically mismatched against global threats. The most obvious global threats, the truly existential ones, climate change, pandemics. National security has not been a remedy to these deep sources of insecurity. It's contributed to the problem in a way. While COVID-19 was spreading around the world, how did national security states in the global north, particularly the United States, how did they respond? Vaccine apartheid, disinformation, threat inflation about China. The Pentagon waged, Reuters, this is like new information, right? The Pentagon waged a global campaign during lockdown, trying to convince countries in the global south not to accept China's vaccine, even though at the time, those countries didn't really have access to US vaccines. They were priced out, we were hoarding them. And so we were telling them to not have any vaccine, effectively, right? Pentagon orchestrated campaign, kind of insane. And then on climate change, the mismatch between planetary problems and national imaginations could not be more stark. Nobody thinks the Paris Agreement is going to save us from the climate crisis. Come on. You add up everything our political leaders and societies are doing. Cloth bags at the grocery store, EVs, carbon offsets, climate financing. The totality of it is far too little, far too late. And fundamentally, individual units in the international system cannot resolve problems of the system unless they can be unshackled from spatial fixed reasoning and the assumption of divisible security. It's a planetary scale problem. How could it be otherwise, right? So now we've got this new best estimate from climate scientists, right? If we scramble to take action now in ways that we are not, then global temperature increase of 2.5 degrees Celsius is our next best hope, right? But they're also telling us that we're going to reap catastrophic human loss in my lifetime with these levels of temperature change, right? So it's not just entire species going extinct, it's not just droughts, famines, it's also the collapse of housing markets and insurance markets. It's also widening economic inequalities. It's also the collapse of social order as we know it. That's not security. That's not in any nation's interest. But it is the predictable outcome from failing to mobilize solutions that meet the scale of the problem, and that scale is not national, man, it's planetary. And planetary problems are not limited to these two sort of giant existential issues, right? The sovereign debt crisis crushing the global south right now is actually a planetary problem because we exist in a capitalist world system, emphasis on the world, right? There's even a way in which we should be thinking, rethinking about nuclear war as a system-level problem. Not just because any nuclear war affects us all, but because nuclear-armed states are locked into these interdependent global systems of signaling and mutual fear. The risks to us all that come from that have everything to do with nuclear strategists approaching the problem of nuclear war as red versus blue, my flag versus your flag, clashing national interests. So the framework of governments securing the national interest has just proven itself incapable of coping with planetary scale problems that are existential for most of us. And you could hardly expect otherwise because we're talking about unit level solutions to system level problems. It's a profound mismatch. The second contradiction in the national interest has to do with how the rhetoric of the national interest is used. What is meant by it in practice, what is done in its name, is often against, not to the benefit of the nation as a whole by any normal person's measure. And so to put it differently, if the national interest mystifies state behavior, what is that mystification obscuring? So Jeannie Moorfield has this great book called Empires Without Imperialism. She evaluated Britain in the Edwardian era based on what it was doing, despite what it was saying, to show that liberal rhetoric then was a deflection from imperial decline and imperial practice, right? And she juxtaposed that with an evaluation of neoconservatism around the time of the Iraq War to again show liberal rhetoric, imperial practice. And I mention this because we can also view the national interest as a rhetorical deflection from what states do. And in fact, we have no grounds for evaluating the national interest apart from what it justifies in practice. Like, on what grounds could you possibly separate what's done on behalf of the national interest from the evaluation of the idea itself, right? And so just one of many, many, many examples. America has launched dozens of military interventions into Latin America the last 150 years. Almost all of them have been rationalized, not just on realpolitik grounds, right, in defense of the national interest vaguely, but more narrowly and more specifically in equating the national interest with the exercise of the Monroe Doctrine, right? So we're talking about repeated unilateral U.S. aggression against other sovereign nations dozens of times based on decisions in Washington that America should have all of Latin America, all of the Western Hemisphere, as an exclusive sphere of influence, their words, and that no outside power should be allowed to have influence there. So crucially, what we're talking about here over time is American officials not seeing Europe as a threat to the US. Except for Nazi Germany, sort of, they never saw Europe as a threat to the US. They saw Europe as a hypothetical threat to an American imperial sphere. Defending that imperial construct was what was in play. And that cost blood, that cost treasure, did not make America more secure because there wasn't any prospect of Europe taking over it, right? And if you look at what's going on today in the name of the national interest, Australia's Defence Strategic Review refers to Australia's interests 32 times. The Biden administration's national security strategy says right there, our strategy is rooted in our national interests, and then it goes on to refer to US interests 60 times in 48 pages. That's not even unusual for the US, you know? So what is the strategy? What are our governments doing in fulfillment of these national interests? Well, the Biden administration, these are all quotes from the strategy documents, but the Biden administration said plainly in 2022 that leading the world, quote unquote, is in our undeniable self-interest. Got to do better than that. That's a declaration of American primacy, right? Which is a strategy that is mismatched with the global distribution of power. Primacy requires unipolarity, an extreme imbalance of power. And yet the world is becoming rapidly multipolar. You know, many scholars think it is already. So why would primacy then be in the national interest, especially considering the high price a primacy strategy demands? All this stuff we're doing now, you know, containment, geoeconomic blocks, arms racing, all of that is what a primacy strategy demands. Well, Biden's strategy also promised that it would compete, quote, with those powers that offer a darker vision, China obviously, and thwarting their efforts to threaten our interests. That's what's driving the strategy. Threatens our interests. Just like with the Monroe Doctrine, Europe didn't threaten America, it threatened America's exclusive sphere of influence, hypothetically. China today doesn't threaten America, it threatens American primacy, hypothetically. So for Australia, bracket off America for a second, you know, am I out of time? This is foreign interference. It's all good. This is intermission.
In that case, would you like some water?
I'm okay. So, for Australia, AUKUS has the national interest all over it, of course, but in the first leaders' joint statement on AUKUS, this quote at the bottom here, right? Through AUKUS, our governments will strengthen the ability of each to support our security and defense interests, right? It's about our security and defense interests, of course it is. You know, I'm sure there are AUKUS supporters in this room, and I'm not going to adjudicate that today. But whatever you think of its merits, AUKUS is the most expensive peacetime military initiative in Australian history, as far as I know. It was hatched in secret, as far as I know. It was hidden from the public, as far as I know. And then it was presented as a fait accompli around an election cycle, as far as I know. In the US and Australian cases, what's really going on when we talk about the national interest is that our governments are wielding this rhetoric to insist that the immense resources allocated to the national security state are tethered to reason. But not just any reason. Their reason is the reasoning of the spatial fix and divisible security, and they're not even questioned about this. And how can they be questioned about this if all this stuff is in secret, right? So what states do in the name of interests reveals the real priorities and, in fact, the values of the state. When government officials and security scholars and pundits invoke the national interest, they're justifying the accumulation or expansion or use of state power. It's just that simple. And that seems grim. It it's not always and everywhere so grim. In a previous historical conjuncture, after World War II, the national interest didn't always function in a violent, reactionary, secretive way for some of the newly independent states. Former colonies asserting self-determination, that was part of national liberation. I would say national liberation is quite obviously in the national interest, right? So there's a problem here, because in this conjuncture that we're living through now, those assumptions of the spatial fix and divisible security are manifesting in very dark ways, right? Where the national interest becomes a deflection from militarism, from poor fuzzy judgment. And the question is why? You know, like, why is the national interest today functioning not on behalf of human liberation, but on behalf of militarism? Well, one of the quirks of history that gives rise to our current moment is what some would call our imperial mode of living. So rich nations, especially the United States, have found a way to create distance between the conduct of war and the consequences of war at home. And this is different from how we understood war at the beginning of the 20th century, end of the 18th century, or 19th century, right? It has always been the case from the perspective of the poor and the economically insecure that war is what Eric Hobsbawm called the disruption and destruction of the order of life and labor. A century ago, military buildups and what were literally world wars, they required a mass mobilization that actively disrupted, obviously for the worse, the everyday lives of everyday people. The involuntary self-sacrifice that war used to demand was a built-in restraint mechanism checking the forces of militarism, right? And Hobsbawm, as the quote here says, you know, he explained that the desire to return to a decent, orderly life implied hostility to war, to military service, to the war economy, etc., and the wish for peace. But when the US was attacked on 9/11, George Bush was asked, what should Americans do now that we're launching a global war on terror? He said, go shopping. So there's this American Marine, Miles Lugosi. He was a combat cameraman in Afghanistan. He made this famous documentary in 2018. It really actually helped turn the tide of opinion against operations in Afghanistan. And he said in an interview around the time of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, there's no graceful way to lose a war, but I feel like the thing that most Americans were upset about was the optics and how it looked, because no one gave a shit about the war for 20 years. It's the longest war in American history, and nobody cared until we pulled out. No one gave a shit about the war for 20 years. It's the longest war in American history. If you went to America anytime in the last 23 years, you would have looked around and you would not have seen a nation at war. Except on like January 6, 2021. And yet America would have been at war the entire time, right? Through a combination of technology and technocracy and a lot of tax dollars and underwritten by spatial fixed reasoning and an assumption of divisible security, the US national security state fashioned a way to do as much war as it thinks is necessary, while most of the country lives in ignorance about it. We do normal stuff. And yet we're at war. The once built-in restraint mechanism checking the forces of militarism have been broken in our present moment. This makes it infinitely more difficult for the stewards of the national interest to be accountable in any meaningful sense. In every American war since World War II, especially in the stupid ones, it is never those directly responsible for mass casualty violence, bad judgment, who are censored, silenced, sent to jail. Policy officials live in a culture of impunity and at best self-policing. I know because I was one. And if you think I'm overstating the case, consider the invasion of Vietnam, the illegal bombings of Cambodia and Laos, from the illegal invasion of Iraq to the global war on terror. These are cases that everyone laments now. It's fashionable to see these things as bad and tragic. But politicians and policymakers have not been held to account for these things. And if you spoke out against them when they were happening, you got censored. And there was a good chance your ass went to jail. These repeated bloody blunders are what we do in the name of the national interest, and they are not in the interest of any nation as a whole. So that brings me to the third contradiction of the national interest. The contradiction here is that the distribution of gain and pain when states attempt to secure the national interest is rarely to the benefit of all, never evenly distributed. Are you kidding? Not even a prospect of that. And almost always forcing the majority to sacrifice something concretely while a few benefit concretely. So if you go back to my example with Guam, it dawned on me that in that moment of the North Korean nuclear crisis, I was for the first time thinking about US national security from the perspective of those most directly sacrificed for it. So there's a longer conversation to be had here about US military strategy, but the thing that's important to know, especially circa 2017, is that US strategy was a really bad, incompetent, losing military strategy. Force projection thousands of miles away against a nuclear-armed enemy that only has to project force a few dozen miles, kilometers. Even convicted felon and White House strategist Steve Bannon, who is not my friend, and not the sharpest knife in the drawer, even he thought there was no military solution to the problem North Korea posed. So, if you have a strategy that's committing serious resources and taking serious existential risks, even though it's obviously bad, you have to start asking questions about what makes that kind of strategic incompetence possible. How could we be so locked in to not just a garbage military strategy, but a military-first strategy to a problem that has no military solution? And the answer in this particular North Korea case, as with many others, is that the bad strategy is built on the back of a rank injustice, right? Here, in this case of Guam, it's a free sacrifice zone, right? American military planners, something I spent time doing in a past life, they think of Guam not just as a node in force projection, but also as a territory that gives America what's called defense in depth. And this is the idea that like Guam can be a physical shield that blunts, slows enemy power projection toward the US homeland. But it functions that way without Guam's consent. And you'd be hard-pressed for anybody to consent to that, right? And planners don't evaluate the cost that Guam absorbs as a cost in their military strategy. They externalize that cost. It becomes literally a negative externality, right? It's negative feedback. So the way they choose to see their cost-benefit calculations erases the full price that's actually incurred by their strategy. And so yes, Guam faces an unjust situation, but that actually gives America slack. That extra advantage that injustice provides, it actually underwrites poor judgment about strategy. It lets America think that it can and even should have military primacy on the other side of the planet, even though obviously nobody should, and even though the global distribution of power cannot possibly even accommodate that. right? So this highlights a profound universal problem with how states try to secure the national interest today in our current conjuncture. So Tarek Barkawi here is calling out a core pathology that runs right through the heart of strategic theory. We cannot choose the rational path without a full sense of the costs and benefits of our actions. We can never honestly answer questions about whether the game is worth the candle if we can't grasp the magnitude of sacrifices that the game requires. Rationality is the sacred premise in strategizing for the national interest. And yet rationality demands that we pay careful attention to every kind of cost generated by what we do. We're not doing that. We're seeing the terrain of strategy in this puritanical way that obscures the actual distribution of not only death and destruction, but also profit and protection. That is pathological. If we're not sensitive to those who bear the chief burden of our relative security, Arnold Wolfers, we will inevitably generate blowback, unintended consequences. We're going to suffer things that we end up calling black swans, but they would be totally foreseeable, you know? What everyone, from Edmund Burke to Michel Foucault, used to recognize as the imperial boomerang effect. It's a thing. Wars never just happen out there. But the national interest, because of the assumptions underpinning it, make us analyze war as a thing that merely happens out there. It makes us believe that we can do global wars on terror, and it won't create politicians like Trump, which is precisely what happened, according to my friend Spencer Ackerman's Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Reign of Terror, right? War on terror was a condition of possibility for Trump, without which he could not have been president. So what is to be done? One school of thought is to just stop chasing the national interest. There's something to this, right? ANU's very own Andrew Carr has persuasively argued to get rid of the language of the national interest as a referent object, precisely because it's fuzzy. So, well, what are you talking about, right? He's an advocate, well, now I'm putting words in his mouth, but he's, as I've read him, he's an advocate of strategy as problem solving, concretely. It's a good starting point. Another school of thought, a little more radical, says we need to look beyond the state itself, planetary politics, abolition of the nation state. There's a logic to this that is appealing insofar as the modern state system is clearly burdened by war-prone pathologies, and the reality is that nation states are badly mismatched with planetary scale security problems. But I think both of this, like neither of these things is sufficient. This is not enough, you know? Bracket off how realistic these kinds of answers are, because the former path is obviously much more realistic than the latter path. But if we're regardless, if we're still thinking our way into spatial fixes and divisible security arrangements, all we're really doing is reproducing, or at best redirecting, the symptoms of insecurity that plague us today. So we have to face the contradictions, right? Any people that share a common territorial space, I think it's reasonable to say or to expect that they're going to have common interests. Yes, those interests are probably going to be quite thin if the basis for it is simply sharing territorial space. No, those interests are probably insufficient to justify power hoarding on the part of national security states. But those interests could be called national interests, right? So maybe we can build on that. How, from that point, do we face the contradictions? Well, Guam's situation, again, illustrates universal potential in its particularity. So, if America didn't have this colony, it actually would be hamstrung in the way it currently thinks right now, which is they think in a quite unfortunate way about everything to do with security. But they couldn't do the primacy strategy that makes Asia even more of a powder keg, right? Injustice and insecurity are actually related causally, not just morally, right? It's not that, I don't want to go down a China rabbit hole. It's not that China is not a problem, but that what we're doing makes the problem that we see in China much worse, right? We're committed to a way of relating to Asia and to China that makes all of us less secure and has no prospect of actually resolving the things that concern us about China. And a condition of possibility for that insecurity dilemma is holding on to a colony that we treat as a sacrifice zone for a loser of a military strategy. But it doesn't have to be this way, man. If we took account of Guam's national interest and supported its self-determination, we wouldn't be able to so readily sacrifice its people. If we took account of the fact that for Guam and its Pacific Island neighbors, they see planetary scale problems, not China, as the real existential threats in our time. If we accounted for that, then we would have to reallocate more of our resources, not to be in World War III preppers, but to mitigating the slow violence that's eating away at the social order in the Pacific, right? And if we took account of the costs our strategy imposes on Guam for the sake of American primacy, we would recognize that our ability to dominate is not worth their death, particularly since, bizarrely, many of them are US citizens, right? Our strategy for Asia, for China, treads on the national interests of everyone in the Pacific. It doesn't have to. Facing the contradictions in this case opens up alternative vistas for how to secure Guam, how to secure the Pacific, how to secure ourselves by extension, and possibly even China, right? And this is not idealism. This is not pie-in-the-sky stuff. Take just one concrete sample example in the realm of geopolitics, how this changes geopolitics to think this way, right? China's encroachment on the Pacific today and America's military dominance in the Pacific today, they are both motivated partly by the desire for greater security each from the other. There's a lot going on, but that is a motivation. There's a geopolitical motive there, right? Both want more defense in depth. Both want a strategic buffer that insulates them from the other great power. But more than one third of the Pacific is either non-sovereign or semi-sovereign, including Guam. And because of that imposed hierarchy, they cannot secure or regulate their own environment, their own region, right? And so, China and the US look on and see that the Pacific can't control its own environment, and so seek to assert control to the exclusion of others, right? China and the US are in a scramble for zero-sum influence, for expanding regimes of exclusion, Pacific policing initiatives, right? Expanding militarization. And meanwhile, all of it's askew of the planetary problems that Pacific nations actually think are the real priorities. But if a strategic buffer is what the great powers think they need in the Pacific, there's actually something that can be done about that here if we think a little differently, right? America, Australia, France, and New Zealand collectively have the ability to end systems of hierarchy, exclusion, and more explicitly non-sovereignty in the Pacific, right? To grant self-determination to places like Guam and New Caledonia, and to make the Pacific a credible strategic buffer, which happens to require respecting regional ambitions to make the Pacific a zone of peace. There's like a win-win convergence of things here. So Arnold Wolfer's Cold War realist, not a flower child, right? He said, a weak country may have no better means at its disposal than to prove to strong neighbors that its strict neutrality can be trusted. right? It's a theory of security for a certain kind of people that involves convincing others of their strict neutrality. There's something in that, right? For the Pacific. Preserving colonies and colonial mindsets in the Pacific, it prevents strict neutrality. And it prevents a cohesive regional bloc from forming. But an independent Pacific that had the actual ability to function in a strategically autonomous way, that kept outside powers outside, more or less. An independent Pacific that's less militarized and so less threatening to outside powers, that enables the kind of resistance that would make the Pacific strictly neutral, a strategic buffer. A strategic buffer that doesn't require one great power or the other asserting control, exclusion, and thereby setting off this ridiculous race at the expense of everybody, including themselves, right? So greater security for all is on the other side of making the Pacific a credible strategic buffer. It cannot be that unless it's independent. It will never be that if it's a site of competing spheres of influence. That's a path to World War III. So, a different world is totally possible here in geopolitical terms, but it literally requires thinking differently about the national interest. There's nothing inherently wrong with polities that use the vehicle of the state to organize around national units. I'm not trying to trash the basic feature of our existence. A world with 9 billion people is not going to coordinate itself. And in one world government, it's a little bit out of reach right now, but a more durable security is still available within our current conjuncture, within a system of national states that pursue the interests of their nation if they do it seriously and literally, right? As long as they can challenge the spatial fix, fallacy, and the notion that divisible security is optimal. So it's a cliche to point out that we're all connected, even though it's true at a quantum level, at an ecological level, at a philosophical level. But recognizing the interconnectedness of life matters beyond the cliche, because nationally organized territorial units in a connected world can only yield peace or barbarism. And so security may be the preeminent interest of any nation, but attempts to realize it by redirecting insecurity at others, whether those others are outside the nation or within the nation, only reproduces structures of harm. But if we think differently, we can literally be differently.